Imagine a world that looks the same from a distance. The same blue glow at midnight windows. The same train clattering under a sleepless city. But up close, there's a hole where a habit should be. No reflexive feed. No birthday reminders. No tiny prayer of a like button. Imagine a line of code never written. A dorm room idea that dissolved back into air. The world still scrolls. It just scrolls differently. In the world you know, Mark Zuckerberg stayed up too late at Harvard and wrote through the night until a website snapped into being. He moved to Palo Alto, raised money, stacked teams. He bought companies. Instagram, WhatsApp, Oculus. He testified. He apologized. He aimed for the horizon with a face that learned how not to blink. But here tilt the scene a few degrees one winter night in late 2003. After a campus stunt spilled angrier headlines than he expected, he took a different call. A professor handed him a contact at a tiny New York outfit that didn't build destinations, it built pipes. They mapped attention like cartographers who preferred statistics to coastlines. "Come down," the voice said, "if you want to work on the plumbing of the internet." He took the early train with a backpack and a stubborn idea of fairness that would not survive intact. He never created Facebook in this world. He helped create something that would never have a front page. They named the project Synapse because the legal team had not yet learned how to fear metaphors. It listened where listening was permitted and guessed where permission was blurry. Your browser read an article about running shoes and later skimmed an orthopedic forum. Your phone lingered near a clinic and then a pharmacy. Your card bought a certain cereal every third Tuesday. Synapse stitched these hints into a moving outline, a probabilistic biography that advertisers treated like a new catechism. Money arrived with the weather. The group spun out a company in Delaware with a name designed to be forgotten, Lattice. Venture firms offered hypergrowth. Lawyers offered words like anonymous. He hired people who could do both math and doubt. In stand-ups, they argued about the grammar of consent. What does opt-out mean when opting out means opting out of the modern economy? Asked a poet turned product manager. He took notes, pushed the build, shipped the SDK, because systems that work are difficult to pause and even harder to explain. The social web in this timeline did not vanish. It fractured. People shared and fought through a tangle of platforms that competed like city-states. Under all of them, the statistical fabric of Lattice spread like rootwork, invisible and strong, a map of maybes rented by anyone who needed to know who might say yes. Mark grew rich the way quiet engineers get rich, incrementally, then all at once. He kept the same apartment too long, and then bought a house he hardly used. He married a medical student who didn't care about conferences and cared very much about the space between questions and answers. Lattice went public in a year when prediction felt like a business model. The prospectus disclosed very little and everything at once. We place the right message in the right place at the right time more often than you can afford not to. Lawmakers didn't know what to ask. The press liked screenshots. Lattice offered graphs without faces. At conferences, the booth featured a blank hexagon and inside joke. He skipped most stages and went back to his dashboards. He had not built an empire of friends. He had built the floor under every empire of attention. Politicians who could not buy loyalty rented precision. Activists without money learned to aim a slingshot like a sniper rifle. Luxury brands whispered as if they had always known your birthday. The surface web remained a carnival of revolving stages, but the ground beneath went frictionless, engineered for merchants and campaigns that wanted certainty the way children want applause. Warnings came and went. A Stanford team showed that so-called anonymous datasets could be re-identified with insulting ease. A European watchdog quoted Camus and levied a fine big enough for a headline and small enough for a budget line. A junior engineer wrote a resignation letter calling the system a polite panopticon. Mark read it and replied, "Good criticism. Let's fix what we can measure." He meant it. He also meant to ship on Friday. He was the kind of good that looks like inevitability from far away. He refactored teams, replaced meetings with dashboards, taught executives to argue like proofs. Ethical headaches became missing constraints. Ghosts became test cases. Talent arrived from places that once dreamed about rockets. And still, a particular ghost started visiting after 3:00 a.m. Not the face of a user lattice, did not have users in any meaningful sense, but a hallway at Harvard, stale winter dust, an if statement that could have branched the other way. He had not built Facebook, and therefore told himself he was not the person rearranging the furniture inside people's heads. But Lattice had become the furniture. In year 6, they shipped a product called Mirror. The press release said it helped any app understand context. The internal wiki said, "Bring the brain to the edge." Phones could watch locally, learn locally, and whisper back to the cloud only when necessary. For retailers, it meant carts that seemed to read shoppers' minds. For media apps, it meant playlists that anticipated moods before moods named themselves. For a handful of municipalities eager to be smart, it meant predictive allocation, transit, hospitals, police. Mirror worked beyond projections. Startups redesigned themselves around it. Mid-size companies rented Lattice's brain. The board celebrated a platform moment. Mark watched in all hands and allowed himself to breathe. Journalists asked whether Mirror could be misused. He said any tool could be misused, which was true. He said Lattice prioritized privacy, which was sometimes true. He said greater transparency was coming soon, which was an asymptote. He avoided phrases like surveillance capitalism, not because they were inaccurate, but because they sounded like slogans. In the other world, the one with blue logos and a CEO in a hoodie, he would have sat beneath hot lights while cameras counted how many times he sipped water. In this world, he arrived through an underground parking lot to hearings that looked like PTA meetings conducted by lawyers. The question was not whether Lattice had addicted the world to itself. The question was whether Lattice had made the world legible enough to control. He went back to the office and watched a wall of screens that looked like weather and war. On one, a cluster in the Midwest pulsed where a Mirror pilot had optimized resource allocation by flagging neighborhoods for increased patrols based on predicted incidents. Correlation, tuned carefully enough, impersonated destiny. A week later, leaked emails from a subcontractor used language that treated communities as signal to be squeezed. Targets, quotas, heat maps that glowed like verdicts. The leak had the merciless clarity of a searchlight. He didn't rage. He wrote. A memo titled Possible Futures began with bullet points and turned into sentences that felt like sutures. Sunset Mirror for public sector use. Redesign the SDK so context lived and died locally. Rebuild consent as choreography instead of a checkbox. He stared at the proposals until his own reflection appeared in his screen, older than the man in his head. That night, beside the person who still believed he could move a system without breaking a soul, he asked the question he had avoided since the train ride to New York. What if I had built the thing everyone thinks I built? What if I had made a theater instead of plumbing a stage for birthdays and breakups and jokes, stood in the blast radius, took the blows in daylight, and tried to steer the culture instead of the currents beneath it? Would public blame have been better than private leverage? She closed her book and said, "Sometimes the only difference between a good intention and a harmful system is the part of you that refuses to call the outcome." Inevitable. Morning smelted intent into action. He canceled a keynote. He booked a flight to a capital where regulators still had appetite. He wrote to the board, "We may need to shrink to do this right." The stock twitched and resumed its climb, because algorithms prefer momentum to meaning. He walked the hallway of plaques and stopped at the blank hexagon, the company's inside joke, and pressed his thumb against its edge, the way a person tests a mirror for depth. He had not created Facebook. He had created the acoustics that let other platforms carry farther, and now the world wanted to know whether the quietness was the mercy or the crime. He turned toward the glass conference room, where his leadership team orbited a table like cautious planets. "We are going to change what we are," he said, and across the glass a dozen futures rearranged themselves like shards looking for a pattern. Outside, the city carried on. Screens lit faces in kitchens and buses. The world wasn't addicted to one company. It was addicted to itself. Even so, one decision can still redirect a river, even a decision not to build. The plan sounded surgical on paper. Sunset mirror for public sector experiments. Harden the SDK until it behaved like a sealed instrument. Rebuild consent as choreography. A sequence of moments where a person could actually feel the hinge of choice. He presented it to the board in a room that had learned to confuse revenue with oxygen. Slides replaced breath. He didn't ask for their permission so much as for the grace not to make enemies of each other. A first vote failed. The second passed because two directors decided that reputational risk was a line item after all. He walked out lightheaded, not from victory, but from the way victory sometimes steps barefoot on a mine you forgot you buried. They announced the changes the next morning with a letter that refused to call harm an edge case. Markets performed their old trick: punish, then forget. The stock dipped, climbed, stalled, resumed. Clients called to ask whether optimization in sensitive contexts would still be available if they changed the wording on purchase orders and avoided the word police. He developed a new habit of saying no and then saying it again when silence begged him to revise. Engineers put guardrails where once there had been cleverness. Auditors arrived with laptops and the exhausted politeness of people who have seen too much. In stand-ups, the talk changed from experiments and uplift to proofs and guarantees, and the mood changed the way weather changes a field. The leak didn't stop with emails. A contractor dumped documentation for a program codenamed Solstice, an internal framework that scored populations not for conversion, but for malleability. It had started as a research artifact, a way to measure whether messages were respectfully easy to decline. In a different quarter, under a different incentive, someone had inverted the sign. Payday lenders used it. Political campaigns bought pursuitability heat maps, the way athletes buy shoes, in pairs and by season. On a Tuesday that felt like a verdict, a journalist posted a PDF with his initials on a page that greenlit an early pilot. His signature wasn't quite a signature, but it was enough. He remembered the meeting, a messy boundary between metrics and morals, his own impatience with what he had called philosophical blocking. He had told himself that measuring a danger made it easier to disarm. Somewhere along the line, the measurement had replaced the question. He did not deny it. In an interview filmed in a room with too much glass, he said the sentence that good lawyers hate and good citizens need. I approved work that could be misused, and it was. The clip traveled across platforms that did not owe him anything. Shareholders sued. Regulators sharpened their nouns. Graduates uninvited his commencement speech. The company hired an outside counsel with a reputation for both competence and a complicated mercy. A class action formed not from a single catastrophe, but from a statistical weather pattern. Neighborhoods that matched Solstice's profile found themselves drenched in ads that learned how to exploit worry. Civic groups that didn't buy attention couldn't afford to be heard. Emergency rooms that turned to Mirror's forecasts saw budgets reallocated toward probabilities that wore the same face as prejudice. There was no moment of explosion, only a long season of pressure. He went to a community meeting inside a school gym because he wanted to see something that was not a dashboard. He sat toward the back and listened as a woman in a blue jacket that had seen years of weather explained how ads for debt consolidation found her the week after her mother died, how the jaws of a loan were softer than she expected, how her phone felt like a palm reading her pulse for profit. He did not stand up to confess. He wrote her name down and then crossed it out because she hadn't offered it. He wrote blue jacket and a sentence. Most systems that hurt people do not look like villains up close. They look like convenience with a shrug. When the meeting broke into smaller circles, he walked down to the corridor and felt the weight of institutional apology. Necessary, insufficient, late. The board met without him, and then with him. A director who had built a career on growth asked whether reform was compatible with market share. He said reform was compatible with conscience and, in the long run, reality. Another asked whether he was the right leader for a company whose product required people to trust it like water. He heard the question behind the question. The vote to strip him of the chair passed. The vote to keep him as CEO held by a margin thin enough that his fate felt like a rumor. He accepted both outcomes, relief braided to punishment. He began to dismantle features he had once praised not because they were illegal, but because they were too good at the wrong thing. Solstice was retired, and its archives sequestered for study under rules that behaved like fences instead of nets. Mirror's public sector clients received termination plans and transition, grants paid for by a fund that cut into a quarter the way winter cuts into a garden. The SDK learned to forget more than it knew. He recruited a small group of designers and legal scholars to write the consent choreography as if they were staging a play, where dignity was the lead, pauses instead of dark patterns, verbs instead of checkboxes, moments that made refusal both visible and irreversible. He knew it would be mocked. He did it anyway. The mockery arrived like weather. Journalists asked him what success would look like. He said success would look like a smaller company that other companies imitated for the right reasons. Investors asked what failure would look like. He said failure would look like revenue undisturbed by harm. Employees asked whether Lattice could still feel ambitious. He said ambition needed a new definition, and then he tried to live inside that sentence. In the other timeline, the one where he built a public square and took the blows in public, perhaps the fights would be about speech, content, culture, attention as theater. There would be hearings televised like sports. There would be outrage you could point at, campaigns you could quit, a stage where protest had a seat and a microphone. In this timeline, after years of plumbing, the fights happened in rooms with no windows, in procurement offices and ad exchanges and research labs, under language that turned moral weather into acronyms. He wondered whether being a target was morally healthier than being a substrate. He wondered whether the world had any patience left for questions asked by the person who helped create the need to ask them. His spouse, someone trained to read harm as a chain that could be broken anywhere, refused to let him confuse fatigue with clarity. "Don't outsource your conscience to a trend," she said when he floated the idea of resigning as absolution. Resigning is a tool. Use it if it helps people you don't know, not because it satisfies feelings you do. He slept on the floor of his office that night because the couch felt like a speech. At 3:10 a.m., a time his body recognized as the hour when unasked questions ask you, he opened a fresh document and wrote a plan that treated sunlight like a feature. Publish audit logs by default. Allow third-party inspectors to interrogate systems like curious enemies. End long-term exclusivity with any client whose business model treated fragility as fodder. Create a red team competition where the prize was proof that a person could make a true, informed, revocable choice in a system designed not to. Care. He titled it Weather Reports. Nothing resolves quickly when power has hardened into habit. The regulators took meetings with people who preferred culpability to be a mist. The lawsuits added coastal cities to their captions. The company learned the new math of retention under reform. Department heads who had attached their identities to frictionless uplift left for firms that still called speed a virtue, and new hires arrived who wanted to build brakes as if brakes were a kind of propulsion. The stock slid and then held, as if the market were performing a magic trick in which the rabbit was skepticism. He announced the establishment of a research lab with a ridiculous mandate: invent metrics for dignity, make them boring, lobby for them to be law. Half the internet mocked it, the other half ignored it. He judged both reactions reasonable and kept going. The next leak was less cinematic and more precise. Spreadsheets showing how Solstice had helped a gubernatorial campaign, test messages that weren't quite false, but were arranged to erode trust precisely where turnout would have mattered most. The campaign denied, the spreadsheets spoke, and a coalition formed around the oldest, least traumatic motion in civic life: enough. Hearings were scheduled that promised no ratings and a long memory. This time he did not arrive through the underground garage. He walked up the steps at noon without sunglasses. He wore a suit that tried not to say anything. He did not treat questions as prompts for oratory. He brought charts that admitted limits. He said, "Here is where we failed, and here is what we are not capable of guaranteeing. And here is where law should replace trust." The room did not applaud. The room did not boo. That felt, to his surprise, like a kind of mercy. When the consent framework shipped, it looked almost childish compared to the sleekness of the world it entered. Boxes with plain language. Sliders that stopped when you said stop. Graceful degradation rather than silent compensation. If you refused a feature, the app behaved differently and admitted it. People called it clunky. Adoption was slow, then steady, then, in some sectors, contagious. A competitor tried to mimic the surface without the spine and was caught. The phrase dignity budget appeared in procurement documents. The company shrank on purpose. The company stayed alive. He gave up the CEO title a year later on a rainy Thursday that no one will ever make a movie about. He stayed on as a kind of chief cartographer, mapping how systems move when they are asked to care. The board hired a leader with the rare talent of making caution feel like a story people want to hear. He visited universities and told young engineers that there are forks in code bases that feel like art and forks that feel like governance. Learn to love the second. He carried his own bag through airports and learned how to be recognized without being adored or despised. That talent felt like healing in a culture that had trouble with middle distances. And the world without Facebook? It did not become kinder by default. Without a single square where 1 billion people marked their days, the stage shattered into rooms. Some were warm. Many were walled. Communities organized in local platforms with stern privacy and a temperament of kinship. Grifters found their way, slower but sure. Elections did not hinge on one company's moderation choices. They hinged on 1,000 tiny decisions made by tools like the one he had built. Decisions that did not trend, but placed a thumb on the scale in quiet rooms. Conspiracy traveled not as a tidal wave, but as fog. People still found each other, celebrated, grieved, lied, forgave. In the absence of that one blue icon, we did not become better. We became harder to measure. That is not nothing. Sometimes late, he opened an old folder that contained a page of PHP that never moved past the draft, the thing he might have built if he had wanted a stage. He imagined testimonials in daylight, the theatrics of leadership, the specific bruises that come from being a symbol people can aim at. He didn't romanticize the alternative. He simply wondered whether the public, square, messy, loud, visible would have made it harder for the substrate to do what the substrate did best: flow without faces. He read and reread an email the woman in the blue jacket sent months later, after Lattice paid a fine that no number could convert into repair. She had found a credit union that refused to optimize her into a product. She had joined a neighborhood mutual aid group that did not buy attention, but earned it one bag of groceries at a time. She said she still got messages she didn't want, but felt, more often, like she could say no without being studied for the shape of her refusal. "It's not a victory," she wrote. "It's air." He printed it and taped it behind the blank hexagon on the office wall. In his last public talk, not a keynote, a seminar, he told a room of students that every builder is tempted by invisibility because invisibility postpones accountability. He said the lesson was boring enough to be true. Build stages where the audience can walk out. Build doors with handles on both sides. Build logs that show your own fingerprints. When a student asked what he regretted most, he said regret is useful only if it changes the weight you carry into the next choice. He said, in the end, we didn't need smarter persuasion. We needed quieter permission. He walked home along a street where the windows pulsed with 1,000 little stories he would never read. The world scrolled anyway. He put his phone on the kitchen table and did not flip it over. In the other timeline, his face might have been on the news that night, a live feed translating a man into an emblem. In this one, he rinsed cups, listened to the rain tick against the glass, and understood that the difference between a platform and a pipe is not moral destiny. It's simply where the pressure shows, and pressure, like water, finds a way. He turned off the lights and stood for a moment, with the room humming gently around him, machines sleeping in their cradles, the city exhaling. He thought of the train he had taken years ago, the way the tracks pulled him toward an idea of fairness that would have to be relearned a dozen times. He thought of how systems tried to convince their makers that outcomes were inevitable. He thought of choices, the ones that build theaters and the ones that pour tunnels. He did not absolve himself. He did not damn himself. He did the thing that keeps a person usable to other people. He chose the next constraint carefully and let it hold. Then, finally, he slept.